Rabbi Eilberg, as Rabbi Malmet said, is known for being the first woman ordained as a conservative rabbi by the Jewish Theological Seminary. She serves as a peace and justice educator, spiritual director, and kindness coach. She recently served as the coordinator of Jewish engagement for faith and action in the Bay Area. And she has written this book, which I don't know if you can see, I'm holding up, From Enemy to Friend, Jewish Wisdom and the Pursuit of Peace. She received her Doctor of Ministry degree from the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Previously, she helped found the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center. And she's nationally known for her work in Jewish healing, spiritual direction, and peace building. Rabbi Eilberg has taught at the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, University of St. Catherine in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Wyncote, Pennsylvania. She has directed interfaith dialogue programs and travels widely for teaching. She's also received an award from the Rabbinic Assembly. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Rabbi Eilberg to talk about making community work when we don't all agree.
Thank you. Joanne neglected to say that the reason I'm here is because she and I were friends in college quite a few decades ago at Brandeis. So that's great. It's great to be together. So yes, I've been hearing about your shul for many years, of course. So I'm delighted to have the chance to be in conversation and doing some study with all of you tonight. Let me just give you a little bit of background of what draws me to my little bit of my history with this topic. I became deeply engaged in the issue of civil discourse and uncivil discourse, polarized, destructive conversation. I actually remember exactly when it was. It was in September of 2000, or maybe September, October, in the early days of the Second Intifada, which I'm sure many or most of you remember. I belonged, as I still do, to a wonderful conservative shul, a place where people really care about one another in very deep and joyous ways. And somehow, so it was the year 2000. So the congregation had a listserv. It was a brand new listserv. We hadn't learned yet about guidelines and whatever. We hadn't yet had any experience of what can go well and what can go wrong when the congregation has a listserv. So arguments erupted on the congregational listserv about how we should be thinking and feeling about what was happening in Israel. And on one level, of course, there was no disagreement. This is a congregation full of people who love Israel. But there were political differences among us. And so there were subtle differences, and those subtle differences exploded into really horrifyingly destructive debate, sort of ad hominem, high velocity debate on the listserv, to the extent that a number of people, I don't know if anybody actually left the congregation at that point, but a lot of people signed off the listserv. So what do I need so much, noise and conflict coming into my inbox every day? So at that time, I remember noticing in a way that I hadn't before, what happens when communal conversation in particular goes really wrong. At the time, it seemed sometimes that the conversation got crazy. I mean, these are all good people, but crazy in the sense that I would read some of these emails and think, does anybody actually think that our beginning to declare war on one another within our congregation is going to help Israel, which is what we always wanted? Like, there was something, people were not themselves. These were not the people that I knew when these debates arose. So that began a long, 20 plus years of fascination with issues of dialogue, healthy and unhealthy communication in general, political conversation or ideological conversation in particular, and issues of peace building in general. So I spent about 15 years as a primary, or plus 15, 18 years as really my primary rabbinic work, circled around issues of dialogue. I actually got paid to do interfaith dialogue in those days. It's not easy to find actually, most people who do interfaith dialogue do it for free and gladly, but I was lucky enough to actually have it be my work. I got very involved in trying to understand the conversational dynamics within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and got to know some people who were working at creating peace in both Israeli and Palestinian communities. Made many trips to the region, not only to visit Israel as I always had, but to listen to pieces of the story that I had never heard about before, and people that I would not otherwise have met, so that I could understand the dynamics of the conversation, the debate more. And I grew interested, as I said, a little bit horrified, and trying on a steep learning curve about the dynamics of conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular in the American Jewish community. I actually wrote that book that Joanne was kind enough to hold up to the screen, From Enemy to Friend: Jewish Wisdom and the Pursuit of Peace, which juxtaposed what I had learned in my lived experience in dialogue work, interfaith, and within the Jewish community, and between and among Israelis and Palestinians, and conversation in the book between those dialogue experiences and wisdom from Jewish tradition about the nature of conflict, the nature of human communication, and what makes relationships go wrong and what can heal them. And one of the things that I learned is that although surely scale matters, a conflict that emerges within a family is different in scale and complexity from international conflict, or conflict within a national group or between national groups. Obviously, the scale matters, but since regardless of scale, what we're talking about is human communication, I learned from having studied a lot of experts in conflict study, peace and conflict studies, that there's actually a lot of similarity between what we all know in our lives about interpersonal conflict and how to heal it, and even intergroup and international conflict and how to heal it. So there was a period back then. I was one of a number of people who were working really hard at the time to think about how we're going to keep this conversation from really hurting the American Jewish community. In particular, and a bunch of new organizations emerged really back in those days in the mid 2000s. Now, of course, in the last 5 years, we have at least a half a dozen new, not Jewish, but secular organizations, anti-polarization organizations within the United States, to think about how can we help nurture healthy dialogue and culture of conversation, even including across difference within the United States. So there's been all this great work happening, and without any question, things have been getting worse and worse. So I've taught classes on this topic in many, many different places over many years, but you won't be surprised to hear me say that I've never taught one of these classes in the middle of an impeachment trial, the trial of an impeachment, not the potential removal of American president. So there's no question. You don't need a guest from out of town to tell you that the conversational landscape in our country is worse than it has been in recent memory. Certainly worse than it's been for 50 years, if not if not before, unhealthy dynamics, which scholars of peace and conflict have been studying and writing about for many years. Dynamics of polarization are everywhere, from the halls of Congress to every time you turn on the news, essentially, or open up any news medium, in which every conversation becomes a rhetorical battle. People who disagree with one another are not just people who disagree with one another, but are enemies. That in many, many places, it's impossible to imagine that the person on the other side of a political or ideological divide is actually a human being, just as I am. There's a very widespread dynamic, as you well know, of demonizing people who are on the other side, and of demonizing whole swaths of people based on the behavior of smaller groups of people. I could go on and on. What I used to consider to be sort of an academic issue of how do you define polarization, and what does it look like when conversation really goes wrong. I don't have to explain it anymore, because sadly, we all know this is all too familiar in our national context. So that's the context in which we find ourselves tonight, February 10th. What I'd like to engage you in tonight is both certainly to look at a Jewish take on this issue. What makes conversation across difference, whether it's a personal conflict or ideological or religious conflict, what makes such conversation across difference go wrong, and what does it take to make it better? And I think that, again, having had the experience of watching how it can go really wrong in a synagogue, I've done a lot of thinking over the years, as you can imagine, about how synagogues can unwittingly become part of the problem and how they can become part of the solution. When I mean part of the problem, I mean that, in my opinion, to the extent that synagogues practice some of the same dynamics that are practiced, for example, on the floor of Congress, in the halls of Congress, it's possible for synagogues in their own way to practice the same similar conversational dynamics, which is to say, playing out an assumption that if you disagree about something, there are only two possibilities. You can either go at one another ferociously, as if you were at war with one another, rhetorically speaking, or you can turn your backs away to one another and decide we're just not going to talk about anything about which we disagree. That those are the only two possibilities. And it seems to me that that's pretty much what's happening in America now. People are either fighting with one another in really terrible ways. I mean, rhetorically, not to speak of when it actually explodes into violence, but in rhetorical ways, or people separating, balkanizing into separate spheres, listening to different news media, separating into people who believe a certain way, tend to live in certain areas of the country, certain kinds of areas of the country. Blessedly, we don't yet have synagogues that are substantially defined by their political orientation. There are such things, but we could do synagogue in a way that moves in that same direction of, let's just separate everything out so that we don't ever encounter people with whom we disagree. I think that would be incredibly harmful to the Jewish community. And I also think that it would be a waste of an opportunity that we, as people who love our synagogues, our houses of worship, we have an opportunity to actually help America with its serious problem of the tear in the fabric of society, because we live in communities in which we can practice. We have the choice. We have the option of practicing the best of conversational dynamics around around and across difference, or we can just kind of do what comes naturally, which is either fight or flee, fight or turn our backs and decide I just won't talk to anybody about anything who disagrees with me because it's too unpleasant. From the way I've laid this out, it's obvious that I have an opinion about this. I think that both of the options that I've named are harmful. Obviously, when people in a synagogue are attacking one another, that's bad for individual relationships and it's bad for the community. I think when people decide we're just not going to talk to people with whom we disagree about the area of disagreement because it just gets ugly, I'm just not going to do it. That's maybe slightly better than outright conflict, but no one learns anything from avoidance. And if you think about difference in your own intimate relationships in your own families, you know that when there's a difference of opinion on the more personal level, if you don't talk about it, the relationship suffers. You think, oh, something bad will happen if we talk about it. But actually, when there's an elephant in the room, so to speak, and it seems like the rule in the family is we may not talk about this or something terrible will happen, everybody's walking on eggshells and relationships do not thrive under those circumstances. So I actually think there's a third way, fighting or turning our backs, separating into our separate corners, our separate aisles, as it were. There's a third way, and I dare say it's the Jewish way. I almost never, I've been a rabbi now for 36 years, I almost never say the Jewish attitude toward subject X is Y. I don't believe in the Jewish view of X because our tradition is so complex that it's almost always inadequate at best and just wrong at worst to say, this is the Jewish view about this issue. There are always multiple views in a conversation about multiple views. On this issue, I am willing to say there is a single Jewish perspective about engaging around difference. And it is neither fight nor flight. It is neither go at each other ferociously, nor turn our backs on one another and just keep our mouths shut as if, duct taped closed and biting our tongues with one another. The Jewish way, as I hope I'll illustrate in a moment, is actually pro-conflict. That is to say, that the Jewish way, I'm saying this as if it's news, Jews famously like to argue, right? That's a sociological demographic fact. So much so, I can't see all your faces, but I'm sure some of you are. I'm looking at, I want to see all your faces. People generally laugh when I say that. Jews love to argue, right? People laugh because it's naming something that's familiar. Setting that aside, that's sort of a culture, that's a cultural description of how Jews tend to talk, generally speaking. Jewish tradition believes in the value of exploring difference. I would say it's pro-conflict, pro-peace, and pro-respect, and pro-relational engagement. So the Jewish way is a middle way between fighting and fleeing. And in a way that I think, this is a little bit harder to prove, it's a somewhat broader claim, I think that it applies to both to personal relationships and to relationships within communities and to relationships between and among communities. So with that, let me jump into some text. The rest of this session is going to be text-based. Text and conversation. That's what we do. Let me just check the chat for a moment before Oh yes, thank you, Cheryl. Encouraging people to read my book. That always does makes an author's heart happy. I am going, wait a second. Give me just a moment to post this, share my screen. So, as I'm sure some of you know, the central concept in Jewish tradition about disagreement is a concept called machloket l'shem shamayim, or generally translated, conflict for the sake of heaven. So this set of texts I developed when I worked a number of years ago at Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies. So just an acknowledgement that I didn't create this all on my own. And this particular text study comes under the rubric of the question, can political conversation be sacred and constructive? Or how can political conversation be sacred and constructive? Maybe some of you thought political conversation can't be sacred and constructive. Well, I would want to say it can. It's not, it takes a lot of discipline and a lot of skill and a lot of absorbing the wisdom from the tradition and a lot of effort. And it's possible. So let me unpack the famous notion of machloket l'shem shamayim, or conflict or debate for the sake of heaven. The origin of this, I'm sure this is familiar to some of you, from the Mishnah, from Mishnah Avot or Pirkei Avot. You have the Hebrew here for those who would like, but I'll read it in English. Every disagreement or machloket that is for the sake of heaven will continue to exist. But one that is not for the sake of heaven will not continue to exist. If you're paying close attention, you probably already have questions about what's going on here, but I'm going to read through the whole Mishnah. To do this Mishnah justice would require that we spend the whole next hour and a half and probably a few more hours. It's a deceptively complex Mishnah, but what's important for starters is there's a concept of a disagreement that is for the sake of heaven and a concept of a disagreement that's not for the sake of heaven. What is, but it doesn't define what is the difference. What is a disagreement for the sake of heaven? So the Mishnah asks, what is the kind of disagreement that is for the sake of heaven? It doesn't give a definition, but it gives a reference, as it were, an association. The disagreement between Hillel and Shammai, as many of you know, Hillel and Shammai were early rabbis of the late Second Temple period, early Mishnaic period, who disagreed about almost everything. I always say, those of you who know Jerusalem well know that there is a Hillel street and a Shammai street, and they do not meet. I'm sure that's not accidental. I'm sure some clever city planner arranged for it to be that way. There are a couple of times where Hillel changes his mind to acknowledge that Shammai was right, but almost always they disagree. But the Talmud tells us that they disagreed respectfully. More than that, more about that in a moment. There was a lot of disagreement about very specific issues, and it seems like there were underlying worldviews and understandings of how Jewish law and Jewish communities should function that led them to see things in a variety of ways. But it didn't end their relationship. They continue to be in relationship. More on that in a moment, but to define the other side. So what is a disagreement that's not for the sake of heaven? The prime example of that is the disagreement of Korach and his band, Korach va'adato. If you remember in the book of Numbers, one point Korach, it's also a complicated story, but just to simplify, Korach says to Moses, hey, Moses, what's the deal? How come you always put yourself forward? You presume to be the only leader of the Israelite people that God will listen to. What about us? Why don't we get to have any respect, as it were? And although from a 21st century American perspective, we might say, Korach maybe had a point if a group of people came to the Federation, let's say, and said, how come our voice isn't being heard? The leadership might say, well, you know what, you're right. Maybe we should be listening to more voices, but that's not how the Torah reads it. The Torah reads this as a power play on the part of Korach, that what Korach was doing and coming to Moses was for the sake of their ego, of getting more, their individual collective egos. It was power play. They were pushing for more power. Oh, you know what? It'll be a while before I'll get just to acknowledge there's sources in the Talmud, which maybe I'll get to later or not, that say, although Hillel and Shammai disagreed about everything, they nonetheless ate together. So that may sound like, oh, big deal. They ate together, but think about it. If you and another family understand kashrut law completely differently, it's not a simple thing to eat together, right? So there wasn't a full-fledged kashrut law at that time, but there was law about purity and impurity, about which Hillel and Shammai frequently disagreed. So it's a big deal that the Talmud says, although they really disagreed about what was pure and impure, functionally, it's like what was kosher and unkosher, nonetheless, they ate together. And although they had big disagreements about who was allowed to marry whom, I'll spare you the specifics, the people in the house of Hillel and the people in the house of Shammai married off their children to one another. Would have made a lot of sense. If we disagree about the basics of marriage law, then we can only marry within our own community, right? No, it seems clear that their disagreements were their disagreements, but relationship was primary. And there was a clear commitment on both sides, a little more on the Hillel side, because the Hillel people were nicer, really, to put it crassly. Hillel people are a little more gentle, a little more soft-spoken, as the Talmud tell us, but they prioritized relationships. They continue to be in relationship. So there's a whole, you won't be surprised to hear, a whole tradition of commentary about virtually every phrase of this Mishnah. As I said, it would take a really long time to fully unpack it. But some of the criteria that arise in the rabbinic and medieval commentaries about what's the difference between a sacred conflict and a not sacred conflict include the following criteria. One is when you're arguing, you must argue with love. To put that differently, prioritizing relationship, keeping the demands of relationship and the sanctity of relationship in the center. Another criterion is that we conduct the conversation in such a way that our goal is to seek the truth, not just to seek to win or seek to self-aggrandize. That's criteria number 2, seeking truth. Criteria number 3 is a willingness to be persuaded, that in a sacred conflict, ideally each side, because this follows from the others, because the purpose of the conversation is to find the truth. What should the law be? Or how do we really understand what the Torah means, or what God is asking of us around the particular subject that we're discussing? If it turns out that I'm arguing with someone and the other person, it becomes clear that the other person is right, then I have to enter into this conversation with a willingness to be persuaded. If I'm entering the conversation primarily with a desire to win, then I don't care if the other person is being persuasive. I have to just argue louder, because I'll lose it'll be a loss for me. It'll be an ego loss for me if I don't win the argument, because the purpose of the argument is not to win, but to find the best answer. Because together, the assumption is, when I said before, the Jewish tradition is pro-conflict, the assumption is that in conversation together, we have access to more truth and wisdom than any one of us does alone. none of us has access to the whole truth. Only God has access to the whole truth. So we as human beings, the best we can do is to put our heads together, put our hearts together, put our wisdom together. Criteria number 4 is the recognition of multiple truths. Sometimes, evoking Tevye, you're right and you're right and you're also right. Sometimes there's one right answer to a question, but actually sometimes in the most complex situations, there are elements of truth on different sides. And so again, if the purpose is to gain more power over the other, then you wouldn't want to see that. But really, if everyone is trying to do this for the greater good, for the good of the Jewish community, for the good of the human race, possibly in our contemporary context, then we need to know that there can be truth on both sides. And criterion 5 is we need to conduct ourselves in our speech in sacred ways. So I could teach a whole 6-session series on sacred speech, known in Jewish tradition as Shmirat HaLashon, Jewish speech ethics. So there's certain principles of sacred speech that in a conflict that's for the sake of heaven, I need to continue to honor. Even though we're in the heat of argument, right? I mean, if you've ever been in a traditional yeshiva, it's a very noisy place. But we're still not allowed to insult one another. We're still not allowed to forget that the other person is a human being just as I am. We're still not allowed to be arrogant in the way, assuming we're the only ones who could possibly understand anything. Right? So there's a whole set of principles that are that constitute a Jewish view of sacred speech, which still apply, and which must be applied if the conversation you're going to have is a machlokah l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for the sake of heaven. I have lots more, but let me stop for a moment and see if there are a few questions or comments. I don't see anything in the chat, but let me just open up for a moment. Raise your hand if you would like to say something. Yes, please. I don't know if it's Saul or
yeah, this is Saul. I'm Kira.
Okay, Kira.
So these 5 points, they're pretty hard to get to. What if you're not willing to be persuaded? You already have an opinion. I could see arguing with love, but some things there are not multiple truths to. And I assume that would also, the criteria for sacred speech would not always apply to every conflict.
Right. So part of what I think you're saying is going to lead me into the next piece that I want to do. But let me respond to one piece of it, which is that the right question for this exploration is, what do you have to do if you want to carry on your disagreement as a sacred disagreement? What do you have to do? Is it easy? No. Does it sometimes feel impossible? Yes. Is it sometimes more aspirational than actually real, that we don't reach 100% of sacred speech or 100% of acceptance of the other's truth? But that this be the intention in order for a disagreement to be sacred, but in a Jewish definition. Ideally, both sides are working on these criteria, which leads to another question that often arises. What if I'm trying to do this and the other side isn't behaving that way? To which my answer in general is, I still need to be the person, even if the other side is behaving badly, I need to be the person that I know I'm supposed to be. And so even if the other person is behaving badly, I still need to be respectful and humble and listen, even though I'm quite convinced of my opinion. But to keep trying to remember, I'm sure my opinion is correct, but it must be, but I don't know everything about this topic, either in terms of just information, or even if the conversation, to jump out of a strictly Jewish context, if I'm having a conversation with someone about racism, for example, I'm not willing to entertain the possibility that hating Black people just because they're Black is okay. I'm not, and never will be, open to being persuaded of that. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing I could learn if the other person were willing to engage with me about how the other person, who's saying things that may be odious to me, but what I may not understand, or may not understand at all, is how that person's life experience has brought them to think the way they think. And maybe, just maybe, had I grown up in different circumstances than I did, I might see the situation a little more like they do. So there's situations where I'm really not curious about why they think overt racism is okay, just to take a very extreme example. But I could still be curious of, like, who is this person? Now, not if they're carrying a weapon, right? That's not the time to be curious. Or probably not even if they're screaming at me. It's just not going to work. The conversation's going to break down. But if I happen to be sitting at a dinner table where the person is actually a decent human being, clearly, or it's someone that I've been in shul with for, decades, and it suddenly becomes clear that they have a completely different view of an issue that's really very important to me, but I know that they're a good human being. It's my job, if I'm aspiring to the level of sacred conversation, to try to remember that there may at least be things for me to learn about who they are as a human being, and how they came to the view that they hold. I'm gonna switch gears for a moment here. I'm gonna come back to sharing. There's a lot more to explore with what I've already laid out, and I'll come back and articulate and flesh that out a little bit more a little bit later. But there's another question that I want also to at least raise with you. It's a question that often arises, and again, I don't know about you. I don't know how much time you spent watching the trial or listening to the trial. We're talking people who have very, very different views, and that they're, in the case, whatever you think, we may have very different opinions about domestic politics. Of course we do. But I assume that there isn't anyone on the call who thinks that it was a good thing for a bunch of people to go and kill some Capitol Police, right? There are pieces. There are pieces that are not that are just objectively true. So that raises the question: are there people with whom dialogue can never be possible? Like, are you telling me I should be really calling up one of the people who not just went to the rally? There certainly may have been some good people who went to the rally on January 6th and to express their First Amendment rights and to express their concerns, as was their right as American citizens. But the people who are really violent, should I be spending a lot of time like trying to reach out to such people, or are there people just with whom dialogue can never be possible? Actually, my colleague at Pardes and I had to come up with two different answers to this question because we saw it differently. And he said, I will engage in dialogue with anyone who will engage with me, no matter how odious I find their view. If somebody is willing to sit down and talk with me about an issue, I'm there. I'm willing to talk with them. That's one answer to the question: who's beyond the pale? No one, if they're willing to engage. And there's another possibility, which is that beyond a certain point, there's certain people, some people not willing to do it, but maybe not capable of doing it. Maybe the conversation can't be useful. Maybe the conversation is not even impossible. And here, this brings us into a whole different area of Jewish law, which I find fascinating, which also could be a whole sort of separate shiur. In Leviticus chapter 19, we have the very, very famous verse, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself. I am God. Everybody knows that, right? Some early rabbi said that's obviously, if I asked you what's the most important verse in the Torah, it's a perfectly legitimate, time-honored answer to say most important verse in the Torah may be love your neighbor as yourself. Everybody knows that. Right before that, there's some more complex stuff, which not everybody talks about. It's confusing. It says, do not hate your kinsman, it says your brother, in your heart. Reprove your kinsman. Reprove meaning critique them or confront them or challenge them, reprove. The word is Hebrew is tochacha. It's usually translated rebuke, which is a very harsh word. In the commentary, it becomes a little gentler. Yes, reprove, but reprove in a way that's gentle, in a way that the person can hear, in a way that's respectful of their humanity. Still, if the person does something wrong to you, don't carry it around in your heart. Approach them about it. Do not take vengeance or bear a grudge against people in your community. And it continues, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, there are about a dozen different ways that the commentaries will say, how does each of those phrases relate to one another? It seems kind of a jumble of different phrases, but just to give one possibility, it seems like the pair of verses is saying, if someone has hurt you, and you find that you really are carrying a grudge, it's a mitzvah to approach them and tell them about it. Because if you don't, first of all, it's sinful if you don't. Because if you don't approach them, then you're carrying hatred in your heart. And the Torah says, do not hate your kinsman. So you're doing something wrong if you are nursing resentment, and that could possibly be resolved by a conversation. And the Torah is very interested in the climax of this little passage is love your neighbor as yourself. If what it takes to restore love is to enter into a difficult conversation, it's a mitzvah to do it. Now, there are exceptions to this and so on. That's for the longer version. Many people are now saying, I think this verse no, I guess actually a lot of the commentaries, the commentaries are either reading this as in the situation of someone who has created a personal hurt, somebody's hurt me, or someone's done something wrong, like they've publicly violated a mitzvah, right? So some of the commentaries say these verses are talking about someone who's flagrantly violating an important principle in the Torah. The passage seems to be saying someone should find a way to talk with them, because if you do talk with them, you may be giving them an opportunity to let you know that your impression was incorrect. Or you may give them the opportunity to say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was doing something that was hurtful. So you may be giving them an opportunity to do tshuva. Or at least for your own heart, you will have discharged some of the hatred that you were carrying around in your heart. A couple of others here. Rambam, the Maimonides, says in this situation, let's say if someone sinned against you and you did not want to rebuke them, nor to say anything to them, because the sinner is extremely common, like boorish, or possessed of a distorted mind, like not mentally in their right mind. So what do? Someone hurt me. the Torah says I should rebuke them, but they're just not capable of having this kind of sophisticated conversation. If within my heart I've forgiven them and I'm not holding hatred against them, then the mitzvah, you should rebuke them, no longer applies. If I can move forward in the situation without approaching the person and saying, you really hurt me, or that the behavior in which you're engaging is really harmful, or the opinion that you're broadcasting all over the place is really hurtful to the Jewish community or to people, the Torah says I must approach them. But if I really know, not because I'm making excuses and I don't want to initiate a conversation that's going to be challenging, but if I really know this is not a person who's going to be able to have a productive conversation, but I can really let go of the grudge that I'm holding, the resentment or the hatred, then I can let go. Then the mitzvah doesn't apply to me. I don't have to approach them. What the Torah cares about most is hatred. Why I'm bringing this issue because many people who care about the issue of the quality of dialogue in the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community, or even beyond the Jewish community in America, are thinking about how the law, there's an extensive literature about this mitzvah of tochacha, of rebuke, applies not just to you did something wrong, but to ideological debate. Am I actually obligated to be in conversation with someone who's written a blog, articulating a position that I think is reprehensible? Does the mitzvah of you should challenge them apply or not? There's a rich source of Jewish wisdom for conversational ethics. What if there's someone who's really done me wrong, who's really harmed me, to the point where, not to mince words, the Torah calls them my enemy? Torah doesn't talk about enemies in an interpersonal way very often. Torah talks about enemies of the Israelites, but not enemies of individuals. You would think, enemies? Like, why? We don't want to be people who make enemies all the time. We want to try to do our relationships in a way that are as good as possible. The Torah says, so you have to leap back into the historical milieu of the Torah. If you are walking along a path in ancient Israel and you encounter your enemy's ox or donkey wandering around without its owner, you just say, see this donkey? Oh, I know who this donkey that is. That's so-and-so's donkey, that person who's my enemy, who said those horrible things to me, who said those horrible things to my children. And you see the donkey wandering around, and you say to yourself, commentaries say this, I know I probably should return this donkey. It's like returning a lost object, which obviously is a mitzvah, but I don't want to do something helpful to that person. They're my enemy. Let somebody else help them. No. The Torah says you must take it back to them. You must, even though every cell in your body says, I don't want to go to this person's house and say, oh, here, and do something helpful. Oh, here, I found your donkey. Think about a contemporary example. Or the Torah continues, when you see your enemy's donkey lying under its burden, let's say you're walking around that path, and you see the donkey that clearly just dumped its whole burden. It was carrying a whole bunch of groceries or construction materials or whatever, and everything's just fallen all over the street. And your enemy person is standing right there too. And again, you may say to yourself, last thing I want to do in a million years is roll up my sleeves and go help this person. After all the stuff they've done, good, let them be in this headache situation. No, you must go in there, roll up your sleeves, get down on your hands and knees with that person and help them. Why? Some of the commentators say because it's good for your soul to engage in that kind of behavior, even if you don't, that kind of helpful behavior, even if you really to put it very bluntly, would be fine if the person would just suffer. It's good for your soul to do that. And besides which, surprising things might happen in relationship. If you reach out in that person's hour of need, that person might then say, oh, that person, I thought they were so horrible. Maybe they're not so horrible. There's a midrash that says these two guys, they finished their business with the donkey, and the two of them went out for drinks and became friends again, and relationship was restored. Why am I telling you? I'm gonna stop that for a moment. Why am I talking about enemies and grudge bearing? I'm asking you to think about whether there are people that you hear about in the news, or people in your family, people in your neighborhood, people in your workplace who, even beyond the personal, they've hurt you terribly, but they espouse views that you find to be really hateful and harmful. Is it okay to just shut that person out of your heart and say, I don't care what happens to them. I don't ever want to see them again. And I'm certainly not going to engage them in conversation. And if I bump into them, if I notice that their car has driven into a snowbank, let somebody else help them. Or even, I don't know anything about the conversational dynamics within your shul, but I know that there are shuls where the challenges of conversation across difference, whether it's people who understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict differently, they're like corresponding to the left of center parties in Israel or the right of center parties in Israel, but here in their synagogue in California, they think that just the other person is really saying things that are harmful. Or you have a sibling or a cousin or a neighbor or a colleague, a work colleague, who's posting things on Facebook about American politics that you just think are incredibly hateful. What is your Jewish obligation in that situation? So instinctively, obviously every day on Facebook, people play out the fight or flight options that are named at the beginning. People scream at each other on Facebook many, many, many times a day, even though everybody knows it doesn't do any good, but it's kind of addictive and many, many people do it. Maybe you guys are wiser and you don't do it, but many, many people engage in that. Or you defriend them, or just resolve in your heart, I'm not interested in ever being in a relationship with this person again. The message of Jewish tradition is that, I'm trying to decide how strongly to say this, it's a mitzvah to try to release the hatred and resentment from your heart. We don't maybe necessarily think, ask the Jew on the street, is it a Jewish view that we need to try to be kind to our enemies? The Jew on the street, whoever that is, might actually think that's not really a Jewish principle. Well, actually it is a Jewish principle. So I'm intentionally challenging you, right, about leaning into engagement, even with people with whom you strongly disagree, whether it's, let's say, people let's not think about the most extreme, the person who killed the Capitol police officer. That guy isn't calling me up anyway and saying, hey, Amy, you want to have a conversation? That just doesn't happen. But someone in your life or someone in your shul community, it seems clear to me from having studied a lot of these sources that Jewish tradition really says we're really obligated to try to lean into these challenging conversations, following as many of the Jewish principles of speech and sacred conflict as we can. Is it hard? Yes. And is it part of Jewish practice? Yes. And I would say it's actually good for relationship. It's good for our souls. It's a stretching exercise for our souls. And it's actually my deep belief that it's good for relationship. There's a time to stop, to end a conversation, clearly. Sometimes when things erupt, it's clear that it's time to take a pause, or rethink, in this particular configuration, this conversation is going nowhere fast. And it's not always, we don't always have to have the most difficult conversations, but in general, our tradition doesn't counsel avoidance. It also doesn't counsel, although Jews love to argue with one another demonstrably, it also doesn't argue, our tradition does not teach you can say whatever you want in the heat of argument. It absolutely does not. So I've been talking for a long time. I would like to take 10 minutes and invite you, if you're willing, we're going to invite you into Chavruta groups. A group, you know what, maybe 2 to 3, Joanne, is enough, 2 to 3 people. When you get into the group, you don't have to do what I'm about to tell you you can do. If you just want to talk, obviously you can talk, but I want to suggest that there are 2 texts that might be really interesting. Let me keep it simple. Just say one. Remember the criterion, what makes a conversation or a disagreement sacred? Sorry, I'm having trouble. Let me stop talking for a second and find the text that I want. Yes. What makes a disagreement sacred? L'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. One of the criteria is communicating with love. That may sound like strong language. Somebody will say, "Oh, it's because she's from California. They're all, talk about love all the time." And this is a 18th century Jewish text from a great rabbi in Poland. The language he uses is the language of love. I want to invite you to look at, it's on page 3, halfway down page 3 in the handout. See where it says Rabbi Yonatan Eibschitz? Read just the parts in bold. In every machloket, that is to say a debate, no matter what it is, the evil inclination tempts the person and says, it is for the sake of heaven, and it is a great mitzvah to subdue traitors and to break the arm of the mighty, and so forth. He's saying, when you're in an argument, when you're in a high-pitched argument, no matter who you are, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, like the little nasty character sitting on your shoulder, is saying, you are the righteous person. You have to win this argument. You're the one who's carrying this on in a righteous way. The other guy is a schmo, right? But the evil inclination is saying the same thing to the person on the other side. The evil inclination is constantly tempting us, saying, it's a mitzvah for you to win this argument. But that's actually just what the evil inclination is saying. The principle is that there is no disagreement that does not have within it the evil inclination that tempts the person and says that his or her whole intention is for the sake of heaven. It's in the nature of conflict. Rabbi Yonatan Eibschitz is saying, when we're in conflict, every bone in our body is saying, you got to win. It doesn't matter how mean you are, you have to win this argument. So how do we extract ourselves from that if we want to be conducting a disagreement for the sake of heaven? This is how a person can know if the parties in conflict, other than the matter over which they disagree and oppose one another, truly love one another in their heart and soul. This is the sign that their machloket, their disagreement, is for the sake of heaven. However, if they are enemies and are holding on to hatred for one another through their machloket, their disagreement, this is not for the sake of heaven. and Satan has settled himself within them. So how can you tell if you're in the middle of the argument? How can you tell if you stop, if you're wise enough to be able to stop because all the hormones are flooding you with this, aggressive rhetorical energy? If you have the wisdom to stop and say, wait, let me check inside myself and think, am I doing this like l'shem shamayim for the sake of God or for the sake of the common good? How do I know if I am? If I generally am still feeling caring toward this person, even though we utterly disagree, then I may still be in the territory of sacred disagreement. If the reason I'm arguing with them is because, to use strong language, but this is the language that the text use, if I really hate the person, and this argument is really just an excuse for me to humiliate them, there's no way that that's sacred conversation. But if I can continue to feel, I'm in a relationship with you, I care about you, I value you as a human being, and I totally disagree with what you just said, then maybe we're still in sacred disagreement. So I invite you to play with that text yourself. I hope you have it. If not, you can just talk and about this, I hope. And it's 9:07. We're going to bring you back at 9:17 to debrief a little bit. I'd love to hear whether there's something that you've learned or an idea that struck you, maybe in the text or maybe in something that someone else in your group said that you'd like to share with the whole group. Let's gather some of the wisdom. Stephen Parkov?
Yes.
Oh, Steve Parkov.
I said after Judy said that.
Steve, we can't hear you.
After Judy said that some of her relatives won't speak to her, I replied, I will keep talking to anybody. And I gave an example, as long as they're willing to listen and talk to me. But if they're not willing to listen and talk to you, then you can't do anything. Mm-hmm. There's no way to get back to them. You can approach them again. If they keep rebuffing, you're stuck. I don't know what you do about that, Amy. How do you break through somebody?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can. But what seems most important to me is that we really try. That we not fail to do it because it's hard, but that we really try. And sometimes, the other person says, no, I don't want to. Then, yeah. Comments, things you, is it Gittel?
Put it on mute, please.
Gittel.
Gittel, okay.
Well, Gittel in English, Gittel in Yiddish. It depends what language you want to speak.
It looked like Gittel to me, yeah.
That's fine. Gittel is perfect. So we were talking, the two of us that were in the group, that it's very hard when people are really on these strong political sides to find a way to break through, to listen, because it's very emotionally laden and people feel that they are so right that it doesn't really matter what you say. And we both realize that there are people that we've had to do what you said we shouldn't do, which is turn away and not just agree that we're not going to talk about this. But which I didn't discuss then, but I will put out here. I did have an issue with somebody many years ago who I had a disagreement with and she didn't want to speak with me. She would actually cross the street to avoid me. And I approached Rabbi Malamed on it, and he came up with a very good thing that worked for me. He suggested that I write her a letter, a kind, warm letter. And I did. And although we never discussed the issue, she would talk to me again. Minimally, but she would talk to me and she wouldn't cross the street anymore. Okay. And she even came into my house. So that was a way of dealing with it, but it really didn't solve the problem of what caused it all. We didn't come to a solution. it was almost like we agreed that we would just be kinder to each other, I guess, but
You were-
without a conversation about it.
You succeeded in restoring relationship. I mean,
Exactly.
doing an act of kindness for someone. That's the other thing about the.
I didn't do any, you can say it was an act of kindness. I think it was an act of kindness for me. I don't know whether it was an act of kindness for her, but my doing it was an act of kindness for myself. But
Mhm.
I don't know that she received it as an act of kindness. She may have, or maybe she just accepted what I had to say and
But things-
whatever. So that was one way of dealing
I
that
think
worked.
reaching out to her is an act of kindness.
Yeah, that's why I said, yeah, but I don't know that she saw it as an act of kindness. I did,
No,
but I
Well,
by her behavior.
You improved things.
did.
Yeah,
I did.
that's what counts.
I did. That was a very good suggestion of Rabbi Malovitz, and it
Yeah.
worked. But we never had a discussion. In other words, we didn't get to that level.
Mhm. There's something that I didn't say before, that all the dialogue experts, that's a big statement, but just about all the experts in dialogue will say that when you're involved in a really sort of high-pitched ideological disagreement, the worst thing to do is to try to argue the logic of the politics. The best thing to do is to ask the person, tell me how you came to see things the way you do. Really, not just in order to get to a gotcha moment, but really like, wait, let's move back. Like, how did you come to see these sorts of issues the way that you do, and what are the values that are most important to you in this sort of situation? So then that's a humanizing conversation. And there's no right or wrong. A person is telling you, about their life journey.
Good.
So that's of a piece with what you were saying. Jerome, please.
So I recounted in our group something that our mayor, Gail Brome-Mittler, who's also a member of the shul, did. We were having some, I don't remember which controversy it was before the pandemic, a year ago fall. It was either anti-Semitism or the library or racism, one of those three. And there was a parlor meeting. It was actually mostly people in the Jewish community, mostly in the Orthodox community, and some other not. But at that meeting, she said, we have to talk more. And what they did was they gave out $5 Dunkin' Donuts cards.
Wow.
And they said, sometime in the next 6 months, find somebody with whom you disagree
Wow.
and invite them for a cup of coffee.
Wow.
Because a lot of times you need the time and the space to engage, which at Kiddush you don't have, or on Facebook you don't have.
So the shul gave out $5 gift cards, or
This is the mayor. The mayor.
where the city did. So that's an amazing idea. What if
Mhm.
got someone in the shul to donate X number of dollars so that you could do that within the shul, like inviting people into conversation with one another. I just love the idea. Just love the idea.
Nice idea.
Yeah.
Nice idea.
Who else? We have time for maybe one more before we close. Maybe that's it for tonight. I had hoped to hear more from you. I got on my high horse and had a lot to say. I really enjoyed the time with you and studying Torah with you around this issue that is really in all of our lives. And I do want to close. Actually, my colleague, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth at Pardes, found somewhere in a kind of obscure text the blessing, may all your disagreements be for the sake of heaven.
Mhm. That's nice.
So I want to close with that blessing for you, for all of us. May we be people who, in a very fractured time in American society, and maybe particularly in our shuls, which are places of love and mutual support and sanctity, may we be people who seek out opportunities to elevate our conversation and to connect our relationships by engaging in when disagreement comes, that they be l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven.